Kansas is set in 1855 Kansas territory, and is the beginnings of the grumblings in our country that led up to the Civil War, actually. So it's at a time when Kansas needed to decide if it was going to enter the Union as a slave state or a free state. And suddenly the people who were living in the Kansas territory were very divided on this issue. So I initially became interested in it because of that name, Bleeding Kansas, actually. It was something that I had overheard. I was making dinner and PBS was on in the other room, and I could hear the segment describing this incredibly violent kind of eruption that happens on the frontier of America. The more I started also looking around me in both domestically but also in terms of international politics, you see this pattern happen over and over, where you have people who are politicized, and all of a sudden it reaches a point where people are willing to take up arms and to fight their neighbor. And it's a story about neighbor turning against neighbor in the Kansas territory, and because it was so important for them to stand up for what they believed and their identity. It premiered at the Hangar Theater in Ithaca, and I think one of the big draws for people there was this idea of looking to a very politically active time in American history, and that was a big appeal for a lot of the people. Something else that setting it in a historical time period allowed me to do was kind of open up the language that I could use as a playwright. And I don't mean like the 4-letter words I could use, but this idea of, because it's set in the past, that I could be more poetic about in describing the land and describing these intense feelings that these people had, and to sort of let my imagination go and let some of the language take on a little bit more poetry than a very, for instance, contemporary play would have. And then I think also we're still in a very divided country. So this idea that we've been divided at times in the past, and today politically are still divided. With the characters that I created, I really tried to make them like these flesh and blood people as people that we would know today. And the character Hannah Rose Allen, is actually a young abolitionist from Boston. And I'm also from Massachusetts, and kind of, if we think of the abolitionists then, I think I would have been an abolitionist if I lived then. And there were also these great kind of nerdy women, I think, who would read Harriet Beecher Stowe over and over, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And then they were also tremendous letter writers. So in a period of history where so much of what gets decided is men picking up guns and fighting, you also had these abolitionist women who were picking up the pens and writing letters. And then it was incredibly that so many of them just kind of left their comfy homes in the Northeast and actually traveled to Kansas territory. And the idea was that their political convictions brought them to this frontier territory. And then so much was about that we know about that time period was that their letters that they wrote home. So for me, that was really an exciting aspect, and I tried to draw that out in the play. With then letter writing, of course, is such an old narrative device in the theater. So then looking at my abolitionist character and telling part of the story of this time period through her letters home to her sister. So one of the characters is Kitty. Kitty and her husband George, and they are kind of the settlers who didn't really know what to do when they got there, and they built a house, and the house had holes in between the boards, and it kind of brought to mind this whole idea of they are really in this place where you can't just go down to Home Depot and then suddenly, or you don't just drive up and buy a house. But this idea of just being out there on the land was something that I really wanted to drive home with those two characters. And also to present some people who were not actually politicized when they arrived there. And then it was only through the events then that George becomes involved, and then spoiler alert, but when George does die or was killed in about the middle of the play, then suddenly we see this huge transformation in Kitty's character. That suddenly this fight that she felt had absolutely nothing to do with her suddenly becomes personal and becomes something that really transforms her as a person. And then we see between George and Josiah, neighbors at the top of the play, but by the end of the play, that's really, it's the neighbor turning on neighbor because of their political beliefs and political convictions. And then with Red's character, I mean, he's a border ruffian, and that name kind of says it all. As soon as I read border ruffian in the history books, I knew I would have to have a border ruffian character. And what more fun to pair him with than, of course, the abolitionist, librarian-esque school teacher character of Hannah, and to kind of create almost like a Sam and Diane sort of unlikely sparks that we see from the very first scene with them.